Welcome back, everyone. We are going to continue our discussion on DNS by now talking about how to design Azure's public DNS zone service. In this lesson, as usual, we will start off with the high-level conceptual overview of what exactly is Azure DNS zones. We will then go through an overly simplified lesson on how public DNS resolution works. This high-level overview will give us some greater context on how Azure DNS zones are implemented. After that, we will then talk about how Azure DNS is indeed implemented and talk about a couple considerations that you should keep in mind when choosing to use Azure DNS as one of your DNS hosts. So, starting off once again with the high level basics, what exactly is Azure DNS? In short, Azure DNS is a managed service on Azure that provides a DNS hosting service for public domains. In other words, it is public domain name resolution that happens to be hosted on Azure infrastructure. Now, there are a number of key benefits for DNS hosting on your Azure infrastructure, specifically if you already have multiple other resources on Azure already. The main benefit is that it uses the exact same tools, credentials, and billing setup as the rest of your existing Azure resources. This means that you can use Azure role-based access control for access management to your DNS records. You can monitor who did what with your DNS records with Azure Activity Monitoring, and if you need to lock down your DNS records to prevent inadvertent changes, you can apply resource locks to prevent changes, which is the same type of resource lock you can use across the rest of Azure. So in other words, if you are already using Azure for much of your network resources, using Azure DNS is just a natural fit. Moving on to provide greater context of how we implement an Azure DNS zone, I want to take some time to go back to a networking fundamentals topic and go through a simplified workflow of how public DNS resolution works in general. Now, this is going to be overly simplified in that we're not going to discuss some of the other layers, such as local caching or working through top-level domains. Rather, we are going to focus on the querying workflow that focuses specifically on setting up different DNS zones, which we're going to use as a springboard for the Azure-specific discussion. So in this simplified scenario for public DNS querying, let's say we are on your home laptop and you want some dessert, so you decide you're going to go to controlaltsweets.com so you can get some cake. Well, you type in controlaltsweets.com in your favorite web browser and you hit enter. What happens after that? Well, your computer needs to know what server it needs to go to by its IP address in order to get to controlaltsweets.com. To do so, it needs to reference the name server that is hosted at the domain registrar, which tells the public internet where the authoritative DNS records for your favorite domain live at. Keep in mind, however, that by default, most domain registrars self-host the DNS records by default unless changed. This means that if you register your favorite domain name at GoDaddy, Google Domains, or whatever, by default, the domain registrar is also going to be the DNS host. In other words, the name service will just point right back to it. However, this can be changed. In the case with Azure DNS, we certainly have the ability to point our authoritative name server not at our domain register, but to a third-party DNS host instead, such as Azure DNS. In which case, our laptop will look up the authoritative name server from the domain registrar, which will tell it to then go to Azure DNS to find the authoritative DNS records that correlate with our website controlaltsweets.com. In this case, Azure DNS happens to have an A record that correlates the controlaltsweets.com domain name with the IP address of 52.188.161.144. Going back to our previous lesson, this is the phone book entry that tells us that controlaltsweets.com is at this IP address. After this lookup is complete, Azure DNS will return the IP address that correlates controlaltsweets.com with that IP address, which is now stored by our local laptop in its cache. So now when you go to controlaltsweets.com, it will know to seek out the server of 52.188.161.144, which means you are now able to successfully get onto that website by the domain name, and now you have some cake. Hooray! So moving on, how exactly do we implement DNS resolution within Azure using the Azure DNS Zone service? Overall, it's pretty straightforward and it comes down to a basic three-step process. First step, we need to create the Azure DNS Zone itself. This is like any other Azure resource. We require a resource group, create a DNS zone inside of that resource group by the domain name we are going to use, and that's really about it. Next, we need to populate our Azure DNS public zone with some DNS records. These are your typical DNS records, such as A records, MX records in the case of mail servers, CNAME records, text records, and so on and so forth. Keep in mind, though, as we are entering these records into our DNS zone, these records are not actually live yet until we change the name server settings at the domain registrar, which is the authoritative source of truth, which tells the public internet what source contains the live records for public queries. In which case, after we populate our Azure DNS zone with various DNS records, our final step is to go to our domain registrar outside of Azure and cut over or change our name server from the current one over to the Azure DNS zone name servers, in which case this step acts as our go live switch over or cutover, in which public DNS resolution switches from the current location over to the Azure DNS zone. And when we go through a hands-on demonstration in the next lesson, we will go ahead and see this process in action. Last thing to cover before we move on is there's a couple considerations you should keep in mind when working with Azure DNS zones, or in other words, things it currently cannot do. Number one, there is currently no support for the domain name system security extension support, or in other words, known as DNSSEC. DNSSEC is a popular method or construct that's able to protect against forged or spoofed DNS data. At the moment, Azure doesn't currently support this. That said, though, it is currently a feature request, so it is very possible that support may be added on sometime in the future, in which case we will certainly update these lessons accordingly. At the moment, though, Azure DNS does not currently have DNSSEC support. The other consideration to be aware of is that you currently cannot purchase or register domain names on Azure DNS. This means if you wanted to purchase a domain name like controlaltsuites.com, you would have to go to a third-party domain registrar, of which there are dozens available. Some of the more well-known ones include Namecheap, GoDaddy, Google Domains, and many others as well. Regardless of which vendor you would go with, you would have to purchase your domain name through one of these domain registrars, and then after you purchase it, then go to Azure, create a DNS zone, go ahead and create your records, and then cut over the name server to the Azure DNS zone. With that, that's going to conclude our lesson on our conceptual overview of working with and designing Azure public DNS zones. Let's go ahead and cover our key takeaways before we move into a hands-on demonstration. We started by covering the overall benefits of using Azure DNS for DNS hosting, which comes down to using the same tools as the rest of your existing Azure infrastructure, which includes the ability to roll out Azure role-based access control to control access to your DNS records, and also to lock down those records with resource locks. We also went through a simplified overview of how public DNS queries work, in which the request is directed to a domain registrar, which then directs it to an authoritative name server, which acts as your DNS host that is indicated by that name server at the registrar. And then finally, we went over the high-level process of how to implement Azure DNS, which includes creating your Azure DNS zone resource, adding records to that resource, and then switching over or cutting over at the domain registrar to point all new public DNS queries to that new name server. That's going to wrap up this lesson. Let's move on to the next one, in which we are going to take a live domain name and go ahead and use the Azure Public DNS service to create a new DNS host for those public DNS records. I'll see you in the next lesson.